Okay, so today's lecture, or this lecture, is going to focus on both of the assigned readings by Annette Lareau, the invisible inequality piece, and then the social class differences in family-school relationships. Now, in the first reading for the week, if you recall, we talked about how the socialization process and the very short formal process that teachers go through in their training is not enough to overcome the impact of their childhood experiences with educators, and that those childhood experiences, the apprenticeship of observation, influences the choices that they make as educators. And that has important implications because for most of them, they're trying to be the teacher that they either loved or wanted when they were kids, right? And so other kids who are not like them are not going to have the same attention to their needs and orientations. So the more different the kids are from the teacher, right, the less likely you are to see pedagogical practices that appeal to those different students. Then in the second assignment, I had you listen to that podcast, and that podcast showed you the power of the classification of school districts in shaping the educational opportunities for the children who are attending Normandy School District, right? But those classifications, accredited, unaccredited, non-accredited, had an impact on the range of choices that parents had in terms of pursuing quality education for their children. But the other school district that would have been receiving the Normandy children also were reacting to what the Normandy school district symbolized for them, right? And so it's not just like when people are reacting to situations, it's actually the meaning of the situations that are really important. Then we looked at the final reading before these two was the Jackson piece. And in that piece, we looked at the structure of schools, the features of schools, and how those features basically produce docile scholars, right? Robbing most people's intellectual curiosity, and erasing the intrinsic value of learning. And that has real implications for our society, when students are done going to school. And so now what we're going to be looking at is family-school relationships. You're going to learn about the different types of parenting that parents do, but you're also going to learn about the type of parenting that schools prefer. Okay, so before we get too far into the weeds about that, I just want to do a quick recap of symbolic interactionism and the things that I think you need to keep in mind, the tenets that I think you need to keep in mind as we're talking about the two pieces. So remember, with symbolic interactionism, social life and social interactions and understanding those things can help us understand the persistence of inequality. It's important to remember that human beings interpret each other's actions, and they're not just reacting to things, they're reacting to the symbols and the meaning that we assign those things. So interactions are actually mediated through the meaning that we assign to the actors and to the behaviors. I think it's really important for you to remember that schools have institutional practices. They've got norms and values and ideas of what parents who care about their children's education should do. And because they have those perceptions and those ideals, they are going to be interpreting parents' behavior based on what they ask parents to do. And these are expectations that exist really across all public schools. And those expectations assign rights and duties to the people. So, in the United States, we expect parents to be peer educators, to be equally responsible for the education of their child. It's not just the teacher's responsibility. And because they believe that that should happen, schools have very specific ways about how that's supposed to happen. And so again, as they're watching parents engage with their children or engage with the school, the educators are assigning meaning to those behaviors that they're observing. And so when we talk about these pieces and throughout the rest of the symbolic interactionism section, I will probably paying more attention to the method that's being used for the assigned readings. And that's because of, I think it's, well, not I think it's important, but when you look at some symbolic interactions work, it's much more rich in terms of its description. And you hear people's voices, you get a lot more detail about what the schools look like inside of them and the interactions that are happening between parents and teachers and parents, parents and students. And so that richness, though, comes at a cost. The scope of the research tends to be smaller in size. There's fewer individuals that are participating. The geographic space that is the focus of the inquiry is also smaller. And so it's important to be aware of who's included in a study, where the study takes place, when the study takes place, so that you can be, how the study takes place, so that you can be aware of the limits of the research. And so even though the study's findings typically are not generalizable, because they are small in scope, I've picked these readings because I think that they help people to understand the persistence of inequality and how the processes help to produce the inequalities, the stability and the inequalities that we see in our society. Okay, so in the first reading, we see data collected from children between the ages of 8 and 10 years of age. They're typically third graders. The children are drawn primarily from two communities, a white working class community and then a Black poor community. Most interviews took place between 1993 and 1995, but the reality is that interviews were taking place from 1990 to 1997. There were a total of 88 children and 137 interviews, but there were also 12 children who were selected, and children and their families who were selected to be a part of a much more in-depth analysis, where the children were followed over a month-long period of time. They were looking at 4 middle-class families, 4 working-class families, and then 4 poor families. Each family had a total of 20 visits to their home, and those visits were relatively long in duration, where there were at least 3 hours per visit, and they included 1 overnight stay. And so the idea is, like, when you keep coming back to the home and you keep spending this extensive time with the families, you have an opportunity to have depth, not just breadth, but also the families get more accustomed to you being there. And so you get privy to being able to observe more like quote unquote natural behaviors, because there are studies that show that when people know that they're being studied, they modify their behavior. But over time, when you have comfort and things become normalized, there's less policing of one's behavior. So because of this work and their inquiry, what Lareau basically concludes is that there tends to be two different types of parenting strategies among the people who she studied. One parenting strategy is referred to as concerted cultivation. The other parenting strategy is referred to as the accomplishment of natural growth and development. Now, concerted cultivation is much more likely to be practiced by upper middle class or middle class families, whereas the accomplishment of natural growth and development are parenting styles that are more often practiced within the working class and poor families. It's also important for you to know that these parenting styles and the characteristics that I'm going to be showing you in the next slide and that you read about in the reading, these are a collection of like dominant practices within the parenting type. They're not purely working class or middle class, purely poor. They're not present in all families, right? So a family that's like, oh, this family tends to practice concerted cultivation. It doesn't mean they only practice concerted cultivation. It just means that that's that kind of orientation. So I want you to think about these ideal types as one, again, the constitutive actions or in that ideal types, we tend to associate these types of behaviors with this parenting style. But there's nothing that exists in its pure form in the real world. There's typically, like, we're on this kind of continuum. You might have some elements of your parenting that are considered cultivation. You might have some elements that are accomplishment of natural growth and development. But working class families are more likely to be oriented over here. Middle class families are more likely to be oriented towards the concerted cultivation, the accomplishment of natural growth and development. Working class and poor families are more likely to see their parenting strategies reflected in that list. And so let's go ahead and turn to the list. Ooh, this doesn't look, it looks a little blurry, but it's because I blew it up. You can see it much, clearly in the PDF. So here's the different approaches in terms of child rearing. For concerted cultivation, Lareau says, parents actively foster and assess a child's talents, opinions, and skills. The child typically has multiple leisure activities that are orchestrated by adults. In terms of their language use, they're much more likely to use reasoning. Children are more likely to be able to respond back to their parents. And then the kids go through these kind of extended negotiations, interactions between the parent and the child. Whereas when they look at how the parents are interacting with the institutions, you're likely to see in concerted cultivation, parents actually advocating for their children on their children's behalf. But you also see the parents trying to train the child so that they too can criticize and intervene. And so that's kind of socialization that should happen to help students feel entitled, or children to feel entitled to question authorities. And they say basically that the product of parents rearing their children using concerted cultivation is this emerging sense of entitlement on the part of the child, where they come to expect certain things from institutions and agencies. And so, for the parents in the article that were practicing concerted cultivation, they were, giving their children multiple activities to do. And the idea is that you allow a child to try different things, and that creates an opportunity for the kid then to find something that they're good at. And then the kids get them to those activities to develop those skills. And in developing those skills, the kid then develops a sense of confidence and expertise that then can be leveraged for leadership roles or opportunities in education later on. The other thing with the organization of daily life is that play dates are orchestrated in this kind of parenting style, where we'll plan for our kids to have leisure, and the kids are having leisure with other kids who are similarly are situated, where very similar ages, they go to the same school, they're doing the same activity. The parents rationalize to their kids, talk to their kids, allow the kids to push boundaries and provide justifications for the choices that they're making. And so in that process right there, one, cultivating how you engage with the adults, but they're also presenting a type of engagement that can be tapped into inside the classroom. Now, the child rearing approach for the accomplishment and natural growth and development is much more likely to be found in working class and poor families. And this makes sense because if you think about the organization of daily life with concerted cultivation, having multiple leisure activities, sports, art, play dates, those types of things, those take time and resources and control over your time. And so upper middle class families are much more likely to be able to have those things. Now, in accomplishment of natural growth and development, the kid still cares. I mean, the parents still care for the child and allow for the child to grow. But the idea is that the parents or the guardians are responsible for keeping the children safe, having them clean and fed and ready, for example, to go to school to learn. The parents tend to have more limited resources. So in terms of structured daily activities, they may not have the same kind of they don't have as many leisure activities as they do have leisure activities, but they also have much less structured time in their daily lives. And so kids are more likely to be just hanging out. And especially with, it says kin, so with relatives, which also means that the groups of children that they're hanging out with may not necessarily be the same age. There might be a wide distribution of ages among the kid groups that are hanging out together. So, older kids taking care of younger kids or having them under their wing, and also the kids having to, find things to do to entertain themselves. Lareau also talks about how the nature of the relationship between parents and children is more direct, and that among parents who practice the accomplishment of natural growth and development, they're less likely to allow their children to question or challenge adults. In fact, that might actually be seen as disrespectful. And in fact, they're more likely to want their children to comply with parent demands. And what's interesting about this too is that it actually reflects the nature of work in working class and poor occupations, where workers don't have the same kind of autonomy in the workspace, and they're expected to kind of fulfill their roles. And so you see the same thing happening in the accomplishment of natural growth and development. The other thing that we see that is like really very different between the two different parenting styles is, especially when it comes to education, is this dependence on institutions. Now, in the reading, they talk about kids interacting with teachers, but also doctors. And I think one of the things that's important for us to think about is that the parents who are more likely to practice accomplishment, natural growth, and development are also the parents that are more likely to be working class and poor. And a function of being working class and poor oftentimes means having limited educational credentials, right? And so when they're sending their children to school or they're taking their child to the doctor, those people, the teachers and the doctors, are considered authority figures, experts in their field. And much like the parent is the expert in parenting, those authority figures in the school and at the doctor's offices are people to be obeyed, whose directives are to be followed. And there's deference to those authorities. By deference, I mean, it's like, well, you're the teacher, you're the expert. I didn't do school well, so I don't feel comfortable being a peer educator. I will rely on you to teach my child. Not only that, they're at school for 6 hours a day, so you have them to teach them, and that's your job. My job is to make sure that they're fed, they're respectful, and they're ready to learn. The text actually says that there's a conflict between child rearing practices at home and at school. And what they mean by that is that in our schools, we want our children to engage with the teachers. We would like them to demonstrate and ask questions, demonstrate curiosity, ask questions, be responsible. There's like gaps in knowledge. But that also requires that extended interactions and feeling that sense of entitlement, like say to, I don't understand. Can you say that again? And expect the teacher to do those kinds of things. And because they don't do it at home, one, they don't have the practice on how to do it, or, the schools expect, if you're going to ask questions to a teacher or push a teacher, there are ways to do that are deemed acceptable. And kids whose parents practice concerted cultivation are much more likely to have practice doing those things. And so typically what she says is that, and another difference about that is that then students who are brought up with the accomplishment of natural growth and development are much more likely to grow up in with an emerging sense of constraint, where they don't feel free to explore and examine and take risks. And again, the thing that winds up being important in terms of understanding this is that it has real implications in school settings where teachers have ideas about how students are supposed to behave, how they're supposed to engage, without really being conscious of the fact that the expectations they have are privileging one social class over the other. Now, in the second reading, and I'll come back and I'll talk about this some more as we go through the second reading. The second reading, the social class differences in family school relationships. Now, Lareau's work is looking at 2 schools. And let me say this really quick. In the previous reading, she's looking at Black and white families, and she actually finds some strong similarities in Black families who are also like middle class or upper middle class compared to white families who are middle class and upper middle class. The big distinction between Black and white families who are upper and middle class are 2 things. One, church is more central to Black children or Black families' lives, but also 2, parents are grappling with how much information they need to be sharing with the children about race and racism among the Black families. And then the working class and poor families, whether white or Black, are again more likely to be having these kinds of parenting practices. So for Lareau, the big distinction are these social class differences in terms of the parenting styles. Now, when she starts to look at and does this study around family school relationships, she makes a conscious decision in this study to just focus on schools that are predominantly white. And she's looking at 2 schools that have different socioeconomic statuses. And we're looking at first grade. So, kids are younger, and she's having classroom observations over a 6-month period of time. in the early 1980s. And the reason why she's choosing to just focus on predominantly white schools is because she wants to take away the racialized elements that happen in classroom settings. So remember what we talked about in the conflict theory piece, that that race matters when it comes to suspension rates, right? Opportunities for educational exercises or courses. And so by just focusing on predominantly white schools, we're not introducing this that other really salient feature of social life, which is race. Okay, so before we get into the findings, I just want to talk a little bit about her review of the literature, because this is important regarding her conclusion. So in the piece, in the review of the literature, she highlights that over time, what we've seen is distinct differences in how parents and teachers were expected to interact with one another. So the first period from school's inceptions all the way through the 1950s. So we're looking at, public schools, those one-room schoolhouses before mass education was normal. So through the 1950s, the expectation was that the families in the community would provide the teachers with food and shelter. That was the family's responsibility. The responsibility to educate the child was exclusively on the teacher. And so there was a very clear boundary between what the parent role was and what the teacher role was as the adult. The parent role was, we pay the teacher, we house the teacher, we provide them food and shelter. And then teaching was something that the teachers did. In the second period, between the 1950s to the 1970s, what we saw was that parents became more engaged in schooling, but it was more about the logistics and infrastructure and resources of the schools. So providing the political, economic, and support for the selection and maintenance of school sites. Again, it's like, okay, where are we going to build the schools? What should be taught in the schools? What kind of resources are going to be in there? What kind of teachers do we want to have? What kind of principals do we want? Right. And so there was this strong involvement in the logistical decision-making process. But when it came time to educating the child, that was still the responsibility of the teacher. Now, the kids could come home and be doing homework, but that would be the child's responsibility, and the parent and the school's responsibility would be, or the educator's responsibility would be the educating, and families are support mechanisms. Now, the third period of schooling relationships, which is the period, the type of schooling, family school relationships that I grew up with and that you grew up with, this type of relationship persists. And here what we see is this expectation that parents will reinforce the learning that happens in the classroom. So I mentioned this earlier, the expectation that parents are going to be peer educators for their children. We share the responsibility. And we're also expected to promote the cognitive development of our children. So we're expected to do things that will maximize their learning potential, right? And then we're also expected to monitor the children's education and development. So we've got to be peer educators. We've got to make good choices so the kids are ready to learn, and that we're kind of incentivized or marketed to, so that we become preoccupied with, oh my gosh, I've got to make sure that my kid's ready to learn and seizes the moment again. Because I think in part, schooling, there's so many high stakes that are attached to where a student ultimately ranks and the opportunities they have based on their performances in the school, right? So you stop and you think about the rule around university and how, like, for example, UT, I think it's the top either 7%, 6%, something like that, in order for the kids to be able to get into UT under automatic admit. Right. So when we stop and we think about the stakes are really high for children, to pursue college and then have opportunities for scholarships, right? Especially with schools being so expensive. And so in this period of time, there is a huge burden that's placed on parents, in terms of helping their kids learn, that didn't exist in the other two periods of family school relationships. So, I mean, one, I love this piece. Actually, Annette Lareau is one of my social crushes. I pulled up a copy of a table that, or created a copy of a table that shows the differences between the Colton parents and the Prescott parents. You'll have to remember that, think about P professional. So the Prescott school is a school that's much more likely to have students who are middle class and upper middle class. The Colton school is a school that is predominantly working class and poor. And within this, right, this like idea that our like parents are peer educators, there's also an expectation about, well, what does it mean to be a parent, or how do parents show that they're vested in their children's education? And what all schools want parents to do, regardless of their socioeconomic background, all schools want parents to attend parent-teacher conferences. They want parents to go to open house. They'd like parents to volunteer. They would like parents to read to their children, to monitor the children's schoolwork, right? And to be actively engaged in schooling. And so what we see is that, the degree to which parents conform to those expectations, they're seen as valuing their child's education. When they don't conform to those expectations, parents are perceived as not really caring. And so what you have in this like real big differences in the way that the parents are interacting with educators at the two campuses. So at the Prescott School, you have 100% participation in parent-teacher conferences, whereas it's only 60% in Colton. In terms of open house, it's 95% at Prescott compared to 35%. In terms of volunteering, 43% of Prescott of children at Prescott have parents who volunteer compared to only 30% at Colton. Then if you look at the interactions between the teachers and the parents, the interactions are characterized at Prescott as that the conversations were long. Even in one of the pieces, it said the parents were friends with the teachers, that the open house was like a cocktail party without the cocktails, whereas the parents who did show up for open house tended to be stiff and awkward and quiet. So, and then when it comes to reading to the children, even though it was actively promoted, only about half of the parents at Colton actually said that they read to their children every day. And then people were like not filling out their stuff regularly, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case at the Prescott School. The parents at Colton School were unfamiliar with the actual curriculum that was taking place within the school. If the child had a learning disability, and was receiving supplemental assistance, the parent might have known about that, but they really didn't understand exactly what was being done for them. Now, this is so much different than the Prescott parents. The Prescott parents were following that stuff. They were on top of it. They knew what was happening in the school. They knew what kind of services their kids were needing if they had special needs. But the other thing is the Prescott parents also even knew where their kid ranked relative to other kids. Right. And so, I mean, there's a very big difference. And again, going back to thinking about what we learned from the invisible inequality piece, that concerted cultivation was seen at the Prescott school. And at the Colton school, the educators wanted to see concerted cultivation. And when they didn't see the concerted cultivation, they made the assumption that like parents didn't care. But that's not necessarily the case, because Lareau tells us that like all of the parents, whether they were at the Colton school or they were at the Prescott school, wanted their children to do well in school. They saw education as an important thing for their children's future opportunities. But how they related to the education system really differed substantially. The piece even talks about at the Colton school that some of the parents there actually talked about how the reading to their children helped improve their own reading. And I want you to think about that. Like the school and the kids that they were, the families that they were interviewing and the classrooms that they were observing, those were first grade classrooms. And the Colton parents, there were Colton parents, right, that said, my reading has gotten better since I've been reading to my child. Like, this is like low literacy, right? And so maybe in the elementary school levels, it's more manageable for parents to be able to try to be a peer educator. But if first grade curriculum is improving literacy for the parent, there's going to be a threshold at which parents aren't going to feel comfortable acting as an expert monitoring their children's work. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out is going back to this idea of the relationship between family and schools being independent at the Colton school versus being interdependent at the Prescott school. In accomplishment and natural growth and development, there's a very clear distinction between, okay, when you go to school, that's your public, right? That's almost like the student's work. And when the kid comes home, it's the escape from work, right? And so there's a real strong distinction. And then when the kids are socializing after school, they're socializing much more likely, right? The other Lareau piece said they're much more likely to socialize with kin. And so that kin could be, right, more diverse in terms of age categories. They see, right, work happening at school, and then home is the time to just be yourself and, have a break and, tend to the things that need to be tended to for your home life. And so they really didn't benefit from relationships and knowledge that they could leverage the parents for their children outside of school. But at the Prescott school, because their family life was interconnected with the school life, right? Then what we wind up seeing in that space is that parents are investing and are able to invest significant chunks of their time in learning about what's happening at the school, building relationships with people within the school, whether it's the teachers or other parents. And so those relationships then become cultural capital, where parents share information with each other about how to navigate the rules of the school system. So for example, at my daughter's school, there's this rule that says that you cannot request a specific teacher for your child for the next year, right? And so if my relationship with the school is independent and the teachers say, you can fill out this form about your kid for next year, but you cannot request a teacher, then I will fill out some information about my teacher, about my kid, and then I'll turn it in because the school said you can't request a teacher. But what I learned through informal practices and being like a room mom at my daughter's school is that, yeah, you cannot request officially, but you can write a description about your kid, and then you can say, and I think given these characteristics of my child, I think the teacher that would be best suited for my child would be someone like Miss X, Y, and Z, right? Now, you don't know that you can do that unless you have conversations with parents, other parents who have done that and know that it works and is effective, right? And so that interdependence creates these kind of opportunities for the parents to get and to curry advantages and favors for their own children, right? And so, the differences in parenting styles coupled with the differences in the characteristics of the parents actually produce some those very real differences that we see right here in this table. So when we look at the Colton parents versus the Prescott parents, the Colton parents and working class parents are more likely to actually have limited education, right? More likely to not have finished high school, or if they finish high school, that's the highest degree earned. Whereas the Prescott parents have at least a 4-year degree. The Prescott parents have higher occupational statuses. So the type of work that they do actually leads them to see themselves at least as equals with the educators within the school. So to be an equal, or to see them, or they even in some cases thought of themselves as smarter. It's easier to interact with somebody who you perceive to be your peer or who you think you're superior to, right? Versus the working class or poor parents have jobs with lower status, if they have jobs at all. And so again, there's that occupational hierarchy, and you're the expert. Shouldn't you be the one that's training our children? The other thing in terms of being able to be a volunteer, attend parent-teacher conferences or open house, is also connected to work flexibility. Lower wage workers are not likely to have freedom to set their schedules, and they're more likely to be hourly workers. And so if you're an hourly worker and you take time off, that also often means a cut in your pay. And that cut in pay can have very real consequences for your existence. And typically working class and especially poor parents are not earning enough to survive. And so, losing out on a couple of hours of work for a 15-minute parent-teacher conference, the costs may be prohibitive to parents making those choices. Parents who have a bachelor's degree or more have already successfully navigated the educational system, so they know what worked for them to be successful. Schools haven't really changed in terms of structure since the 1970s, and so they can leverage their experience and their knowledge as a competitive advantage and help to create a competitive advantage of like advocating for resources for their children compared to working class or poor families. Family life too, it's just, again, like when workers have more flexibility and autonomy over their work life, that can have an impact on how you structure your family life. You can have extra resources, right? Predictability. And so even here, when you have an open house in the evening and you ask parents not to bring their children, parents with limited economic resources or, non-standard work weeks may not be able to do those kinds of things, right? And then also, I mentioned this with the information about schooling, that, parents actually see, right, the parents who practice concerted cultivation and who have successfully navigated the education system know that advocating for your children to get the best advantages possible really early on in their school experience will continue to pay off as they move further along their education. So, for example, we only do class ranks in 9th through 12th grade. But having an understanding about how schooling happens, people who want their children and understand that in order for their children to get into highly selective or competitive schools will know that they need to start having access to better educational opportunities, like even before high school. And so they will advocate for their children and push for their children to be put into gifted and talented programs or extra enrichment activities that will pay off later. Whereas, other parents may not have that same level of understanding. And so they're advocating for their children would be different. And then that translates into different opportunities. And then again, going back to that interdependence, parents, working class parents, social networks, the people that they interact with and they spend time with tends more often to be family. And, family life is different than school life versus parents' social networks they're more likely to actually work on facilitating and developing relationships with other families at the schools, in part so that they can build cultural capital and learn things so that they can advocate to give their kids a competitive advantage. Now, both types of child rearing have strengths and aptitudes, right? So if you think about the concerted cultivation component, kids are developing skill sets and proficiencies that make them seem exceptional. But their lives are highly regulated and super organized, and it's parents that are responsible for doing it. So kids are being rushed from activity A to activity B to activity C. Their lives are hyper structured. And so, the world revolves around the children. And so, those kids are accustomed to being entertained, to being centered, to have activities defined and structured for them. Versus you look at the accomplishment, natural growth, and development, because they're kind of on their own and it's mixed group settings and they may not have that same kind of leadership among parents dictating what the children are going to do. They're more likely to be creative, innovative, inclusive, because they have to think about the diversity of people that they're interacting with, more group oriented. And so in that sense, right, there can be really valuable skill sets and that are developed in the way that kids who are brought up under the accomplishment, natural growth, and development, there can be real value associated with the proficiencies that kids develop in that setting. But our schools actually want parents to practice concerted cultivation. And the children invariably wind up getting rewarded for their parents complying or following concerted cultivation. So in this sense, right, that concerted cultivation is a constitutive action. It is the ideal type. Whether it's a working class school or a poor school, they want parents to perform their parenting roles in a way that's easier for upper middle class families to do. And because they use the same metric to evaluate the parents who do not practice concerted cultivation are viewed as parents who are not as vested in their children's education as the parents who do practice that. And because that's the case, the strengths, well, let me say this, because that's the case, the kids whose parents can practice concerted cultivation are more likely to get the support from the teachers and the benefits of the doubt from the teachers than kids whose parents don't. And this has all kinds of implications for disciplinary problems, for students not doing their homework. Even in the piece, it actually talks about how, there was a parent who was emphasizing grades so much that the teacher basically said, like, the kid is immobilized and can't do their work because they're worried about how their parents are going to respond to them. So even when a parent is parenting poorly, because they're in the direction of concerted cultivation, the parents felt bad and were like, oh, we need to help this kid, right? Versus when a kid's parents don't perform that, there's the concerted cultivation, there's an increased chance that the teachers are going to say, well, if the parent doesn't care about the child, why should I care so much, right? Especially when you're under-resourced, understaffed, and you have way too many kids in your classroom. And it's unfortunate because privileging concerted cultivation actually gives upper middle class kids an even greater advantage because that's the kind of parenting that we value. At the same time, what happens is the strengths that you can see among children who are raised in the accomplishment of natural growth and development, their skills and their aptitudes are not tapped by the schools. And so I think this is kind of interesting because our schools are the places where kids are supposed to learn. And kids are supposed to come in there and adapt to or they're supposed to master the skills to become productive members of society. And schools are in a position to recognize that parents have different skill sets and different aptitudes. And rather than adapting their expectations to what are the constraints within the community, the education sector basically says, well, we're not going to change, but we'll tell you how to behave so that you can behave the right way. And that winds up just creating a differential advantage, one that actually benefits the upper middle class, and at the same time really puts working class and poor families at a competitive disadvantage. And we don't even see the power of that expectation that parents should be peer educators is so powerful. So it's like hegemonic is the term that I think of, that we don't even recognize it, that it's actually a class bias, a bias in favor of the upper middle class and a bias against the working class and poor. Okay, I'm going to stop there. This is the last sets of readings. I hope you enjoyed them. Next week's readings are going to be even better.